Hey AP, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about intro to the urinary system today. Like I said, keep trying to bust these out for you guys a little bit. Hopefully have them all up by the end of the month here. So urinary system, to me, this one's kind of an interesting one. We're going to see there's a few organs that are a part of this. I could do most of the urinary system in about 10 minutes. It's the kidneys that take forever on this one. So this one's going to be a little bit of intro about what it's doing in a basic structure of the kidneys. So urinary system, like I said, is the kidneys, the ureter, urinary bladder, and urethra. The kidneys are where really all the physiology is happening. The ureters are tubes to basically take urine from what's making it to the storage tank. The bladder is a storage tank, and then the urethra is the drain. So on that, most of this is really straightforward, not a lot to talk about on it. The kidneys, on the other hand, are 90% of what we have to talk about. So kidneys really doing, the urinary system in general is really doing a couple of main things here. Our body does generate a lot of waste products. Those waste products, because the cells can't leave, end up surrounding the cells, which means sooner or later they end up in the bloodstream. So much like what I said before, anything that needs to get in or out of a cell ends up in the bloodstream sooner or later. I always kind of say the bloodstream is kind of like the garbage man a little bit when it comes to the urinary system, in that because it can go and empty the truck, there's always room in the truck. If we don't have the kidneys removing this waste products out of the blood, sooner or later the waste products would build up in the blood, and it would be like if garbage stopped being picked up. Sooner or later you would have garbage out at the road, and then it would make a big giant pile, and it would be gross everywhere. Kind of the same thing with the bloodstream here. We need to remove this waste products from the blood, and then we need to get them out of the body. Because this is dealing with blood and there's certain things that we can kind of put in or out here, what we're going to see is the third thing that really happens with this is there is a big amount of regulation in terms of blood volume, electrolyte concentrations, acidity, alkalinity. Because we are tweaking what's in the blood, we can mess with homeostasis of a lot of different things with the kidneys. Again, the kidneys are doing the real tough job here, which is removing the waste products from the urine while trying to keep all the good stuff. The rest of the urinary tract is doing the job of elimination. So it's tubes to the bladder, which the bladder lets us expel it when it's convenient versus as we make it, because we'd be making it all the time. And then the urethra is, like I said, basically the drain to the bladder. And micturition or urination is that process of the bladder contracting to force the urine out of the body. Again, because this is involved with the capillary bed, and we talked a little bit about the filtration pressure and all that, with the kidneys, in order to regulate what is in the blood, we make a filtrate. Because of that, we need a particular blood pressure, and we're going to see blood volume and blood pressure. The kidney has to be highly involved in it because the kidney needs a correct pressure to be able to do its job. And if pressure gets too high or too low, kidneys can't do what they're supposed to be doing. So we know the kidney can make EPO. We know the kidney can make renin. We've talked about those things and what they do. Again, because we're making a filtrate and then deciding what stays in the filtrate and what doesn't, there's a lot of regulation of electrolytes. So sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, all being regulated somewhat by the kidneys in terms of what stays in the urine, what gets reabsorbed. Similar idea with blood pH. We have the capability to excrete hydrogen ions or excrete bicarbonate ions, which makes this, it's a little bit slower than breathing, but it's our other physiologic regulator of blood pH. So by excreting hydrogen ions, we can make the blood more alkaline. By excreting bicarbonate ions, we can make it more acidic, and this is a way we can deal with blood acidity or alkalinity along with the breathing rate. So these are the two main physiologic regulators. Finally, because this filtrate, we can be somewhat selective and by pushing it through membranes and stuff like that, but it's not a perfect filter. There's going to be nutrients that we don't want to become part of the urine, and they become part of the filtrate. Because of that, we have to reabsorb a lot of things here in order to make sure that stuff we want to keep doesn't end up being urinated out. And then finally, the kidneys, along with the liver, really do a lot of detoxification of poisons, clearance of those, which again part of the reason anything that they want to test for a lot of times in terms of drugs, other stuff like that, almost done a good chunk of them, there is a urine test for that. And the main reason is again, anything that ends up in the bloodstream, a lot of times at some level you'll see it ending up in the urine. So the kidneys are retroperitoneal. They're on the backside of the body, usually just beneath your, at least the majority of them are just beneath your last ribs. They have the peritoneum overlying them. Not much holding them in place. They have a fat capsule and some supporting connective tissue surrounding them. Again, not as big as you would think in from seeing TV shows and stuff like that. Held in place, there is a capsule that surrounds them. So this organ does have a dense irregular connective tissue capsule. It's then surrounded by some fatty tissue, which again, because the kidneys are somewhat exposed, unlike the heart, the lungs, and other stuff like that, they're usually beneath the ribs. They can be damaged a little bit easier, so we put some protective tissue around them. And then there is this fascia, part of it, the peritoneum, that helps to hold these kidneys in place. But in terms of blood supply and stuff like that, one main artery going in, one main vein leaving, one main tube in terms of the ureter. In terms of organs, probably one of the easier ones to actually transplant, in that it's a little bit more plug and play. Again, the kidney's not as big as you think. I think it says they're 10 centimeters long, 5.5 centimeters wide. I mean, it's about 4 inches long by a little over 2 inches wide by a little over 1.5 inches thick. So not particularly large. By about yay thick. They're not particularly large structures. They are kidney bean shaped. I think the bean got its name from the kidney, not the other way around, but they have this hilum and this indentation on it where the arteries and nerves and vein and ureter all attach. We can see there is a space where all that is going into. So this area right here would be that renal sinus that those go into. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a lot of the structures of the kidney. As you'll see on this one here, a lot of the same image. We're going to be pointing out a few different things. So you can see that there's a capsule surrounding this. Again, helps hold some of that stuff in place, especially as it enters into the hilum, the capsule does. The renal cortex is going to be this outer part here, so you can see the lighter thing right here going around. That would be the renal renal cortex. It's more granular. We're not going to be able to do dissection with these things, but I can maybe try to find an image of them, but you'll see the texture of it would be definitely different than the renal medulla, which is that inner part in. So the medulla would be from here inward. We're going to see that there is, based on the structure in these filtering units, you get these groups of tubules that are a darker color in structure. You can see them on the real kidney over here. That is called renal pyramids, which make up, along with the areas in between them, the renal medulla. And the tip of these pyramids is what is called the renal papilla. That is kind of this funnel that drains into these different sinuses. You have the renal columns, which are in between, and what we have going on here is mainly a lot of blood vessels taking blood supply up to this cortex where the filtering is going to take place. When we talk about a renal lobe, it is basically one of these pie slices here. So you could go like this. It's going to be that renal pyramid and the area of cortex above it. And again, this is like pretty much a unit that's going to make urine and bring it down to that renal papilla, get it into those tubules there, and once it's into those calyces, we're going to see that it is basically urine at that point. Like I said, the renal papilla is this little drain. It drains from these pyramids into this minor calyx. You can see a lot of these minor calyces, and again, we're looking at this in a 2D thing here. These are more cone-shaped, and there's going to be multiple ones coming in from the side. So again, we're just looking at a coronal slice of this. Again, realize it is in 3 dimensions, but you have these minor calyces. You can see one from behind the field of view coming in right here. All these minor calyces go to like 3 or 5 major calyces, and those major calyces are going to merge together to make what is called the renal pelvis, which is sooner or later going to become the ureter. And like I said, that renal pelvis is this kind of funnel shaped as it's starting to leave the margin of the kidney, where you get this area here where it's becoming one tube, and then it's going to narrow down and become the ureter. And at that point, it's taking the fluid, which is now urine, down to the bladder. Again, kidneys, they extremely good blood supply. Again, they are blood filters. It's like an oil filter on a car. This is taking out stuff we don't want in the blood. So not surprisingly, there is really good blood supply into these. And under rest conditions, it's really about a quarter of your cardiac output every minute going through the kidneys. Obviously, when you're exercising, we can reduce that. But again, it's about 1,200 mils, so 1.2 liters a minute. So over about 4 or 5 minutes, you're going to filter your entire blood supply. To me, things to really know on this one, renal artery, renal vein are to me some of the really key things to know. I'm not going to get real crazy on all the blood supply here, but to me, it's in and out of the kidney and in and out of the nephron. So other stuff to know is going to be these afferent arterioles going to the glomerulus, to the efferent arterioles, to the peritubular capillaries. We'll look at some more of that later on, but those to me are the areas of blood supply that I want you to know the names of. But you can see the renal pyramids are here, and you can see that some of these main branches of the blood vessels are going up those renal columns to get to those areas of cortex. And that's what these segmental, interlobular, afferent arterioles, again, the afferent arterioles is what's actually going to take the blood supply to the nephron, which is going to be the filtering unit of the kidney. We're going to get into that in a lot more detail. I'll just introduce it on this one and then walk through it on the next show. Again, you can introduce it right here. This is a nephron. This is the filtering unit of the kidney. When we've looked at slides, again, this is epithelial tubes. When you looked at kidneys, kidney tubules in A&P1, we talked about just simple cuboidal. The main thing is these are convoluted tubules, are branching, and not branching, but they're twisting back and forth. When you slice through that, what you're going to see is circle, 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 circle. And that's why you don't see this structure. But you can see you have the afferent arteriole brings the blood supply into here. We make it filtrate in here, and then it is going to work through these proximal convoluted tubules, down this loop of Henle, through the distal convoluted tubules, into a collecting duct that sooner or later goes down to the renal papilla and into the calyx. And again, it's the processes that take place in this nephron which are going to determine how the urine is made. Again, we're going to go through this in a lot more detail on this one, but proximal convoluted tubules doing a lot of reabsorption of nutrients, decent amount of water. As we get to loop of Henle, a lot more water. Distal convoluted tubules doing a lot of secretion and a little bit of water reabsorption depending on what's going on. And again, these are all, the vast majority of this structure is up in that cortex. We're going to see the loop of Henle can dip down a little bit into the medulla on certain nephrons. On other ones, it dips down much further, but this is our basic filtering unit. Again, the renal corpuscle, we looked at these as well in A&P1 when we looked at simple squamous. It's what lines this. You have a capillary bed, a space around it. Again, we know under most conditions we favor filtration somewhat. We try to do this through a number of mechanisms here to really favor a filtrate being made. It is going to go into these tubules, and again, we reabsorb most of what goes into them, but that is what's going to determine what the urine becomes. So a lot of times they talk about this renal capsule being Bowmans Capsule, and it is a bunch of capillaries, those fenestrated capillaries. We can see there's one blood vessel going into this capillary bed, one going out. A lot of times the diameters on these will be a little bit different to favor a higher pressure in this area here, which will increase filtration. And that is a lot of what's going on with the nephron, or the glomerulus specifically, is a lot about generating that filtrate and then using the rest of the nephron to modify what stays in the filtrate to become urine, what gets reabsorbed out. So the names of these, again, the renal tubules, these are all the stuff after that Bowman's capsule. You have a proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means twisted. I always joke around, my explanations are convoluted. But the proximal convoluted tubule, proximal because it's closer to the beginning, twisty, turny tube. Has a lot of microvilli on this one. We'll look at some of this a little bit later on, but has a lot of microvilli because it's doing a lot of reabsorption. We then have the nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle, has this descending and ascending loop. We're going to see these structures are a little bit different on this. As we get a little bit later on, you're going to see that the permeabilities of the descending and ascending loops are a little bit different, and it helps with really generating this salt gradient that helps us reabsorb more water out of the filtrate. We'll get into all of it a little bit more. The ascending limb, though, comes back up to the distal convoluted tubule, not quite as branchy and not quite as twisty as the proximal, a little bit shorter. The main thing with this one, does not have those microvilli. It's doing a little bit more generally in terms of excretion. Can reabsorb water if ADH is present and things like that. We'll talk about that later on too. But its structure is a little bit different. And again, this kind of shows you that idea, the different parts of the nephron. Again, because we're doing different things with that filtrate at different times, we're going to see different structures in terms of the epithelium. Everything's lined with epithelium, but what's going on there depends a little bit on what we need this function to be. So microvilli a lot in the proximal convoluted tubule, why it's doing a lot of reabsorption. We don't see as much reabsorption in those other areas. It doesn't have those microvilli. We see certain thin segments and thick segments depending upon what we need going on there. Water gets out of that thin segment easier. We want that to happen. The ascending limb, the thick segment, we don't want that to happen. And that's why we see some of these differences. Again, we'll get into more of what the nephron does as we go through it. And the last thing to really kind of talk about here is just that there is two main types of nephrons. You have what are called cortical nephrons. These are nephrons, and this is about 85% of them, are mainly in the cortex with just the tip of their loop of Henle dropping down into the medulla. And they have what are called paratubular capillaries surrounding a lot of their tubules here. But you can see that network branches all over the place. Where these juxtamedullary nephrons, juxta means next to the medulla. Juxtamedullary nephrons are next to the medulla nephrons. They have a much longer loop of Henle. It dips way down into that medulla. We're going to see this can help with water reabsorption. The other thing that's kind of interesting on these ones is you can see down on this one here, you have something called the vasa recta, and it is actually not branching on each of the sides here. It's going to travel down that descending loop and back up the ascending loop in terms of the blood flow. And we'll see a little bit later on that helps us reabsorb a decent amount of water because we can pick up some sodium first and then pick up the water later on. It's really kind of a neat little thing. So, like I said, the cortical nephrons, about 85% of nephrons, majority of the nephron in the cortex on these ones has a paratubular capillaries that surround everything, where these juxtamedullary nephrons, they are going to have paratubular capillaries that surround those proximal distal convoluted tubules, but they have the specialized capillary bed called the vasa recta that is going to dip down around that juxtamedullary nephron loop of Henle. And the other thing we see in these ones, loop of Henle dips very, very deep down into the actual medulla of these kidney, of the kidney. So we'll start looking at more of what happens at the nephron in the next show.